They said Chief Warrant Officer 3, Avery Torres, wasn't cut out for combat rescues in the burning fields of the Marja district. Yet 48 hours later, 340 Marines were bleeding out in a kill zone the Pentagon had already labeled a lost cause. Every high-ranking officer repeated the same judgment. Extraction was impossible. The wounded were as good as gone, and sending more aircraft into that inferno would only add to the body count. Avery ignored every command, broke every regulation, and flew straight into the one stretch of sky no pilot was ever meant to return from. At 29, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Torres had already become the most talked-about pilot at Camp Liberty. Standing 5'6" in her flight boots, lean and wiry. With sun-streaked hair pinned in a tight regulation bun and eyes the cold gray blue of a Nevada winter, she didn't look like someone who'd logged more than 900 combat hours in UH-60 Blackhawks. For 6 years, she'd flown with an Army Aviation Task Force that supported Marine operations, earning an Air Medal for valor that most pilots never come close to in an entire career. But none of that mattered to the battalion brass who watched her step into the operations center on that August morning in 2011. They saw someone who looked barely old enough to have finished flight school and judged her before she even opened her mouth. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world right now, drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this hit you the way they hit us, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The Marja summer was a furnace that stripped color from the land. The sky white by noon, the air thick with dust that coated engines, throats, and lungs like chalk. Torres had been stationed at Liberty for 3 months, flying medevac and supply missions across Afghanistan's deadliest terrain. She knew every dry riverbed, every mud brick compound, every open stretch where ambushes waited like traps. She'd pulled out wounded Marines from firefights that most pilots wouldn't even approach. Yet, when she entered the briefing room that morning, the men clustered around the map barely lifted their eyes. Avery Torres had grown up in Carson City, Nevada, where her father, Eli Torres, ran a small civilian search and rescue outfit from an old hangar on the edge of town. His own service in Desert Storm had taught him how to fly combat helicopters, and he'd put Avery in the left seat of an old Hughes 500 long before she turned 16. By graduation, she could shove that little ship through mountain passes in zero visibility and set it down on strips of ground that would make most pilots quit. Her father never framed flying as a man's trade. He called it a thinking person's job, and he drilled into her that the line between life and death was often decided by 3 seconds of clear judgment under pressure, the kind of pressure that freezes most people's minds. She enlisted at 19 and went off to warrant officer candidate school. Fort Rucker and flight school were the easy part. She had more stick time than half her instructors. The real fight was proving every day to people who saw only a liability where she saw a pilot. She finished top of her class in instrument navigation and tactical flight, picked up an air assault badge, an air medal, and a reputation for taking on runs other pilots called suicidal. She'd once pulled a 4-man recon element out of a hot landing zone in Kunar with rounds chewing at the airframe from 3 directions, flying by feel and memory through a brownout with only NVGs to guide her. The finesse came from her father. The grit came from knowing no matter how good she was, someone would always assume she wasn't. That morning's briefing had been supposed to be routine. A Marine rifle company had pushed deep into the Caras Valley, clearing compounds the insurgents had held for years, and the operation went south fast. An IED blew the lead vehicle. Then enemy fighters hit them from 3 directions with machine guns, RPGs, and sniper fire. Within 20 minutes, the unit was pinned in an irrigation ditch with no cover, no air support, and casualties rising by the minute. 40 wounded at first, then 70 10 minutes later. By the time Avery stepped into the operations center, the count had ballooned past 340. Colonel Maddox stood at the map table with his arms folded, a career infantryman of 48, with a chest full of ribbons and a face like carved stone. He stared at the map as if it were a puzzle with no solution. Medevac birds had tried twice and been driven off by withering fire. A pair of Army Apaches had emptied their ordnance into surrounding compounds. But the enemy was dug in and not budging. The only landing zone large enough for a Blackhawk was a dried riverbed 600 meters from the pinned Marines, completely exposed to fire from the high ground. Major Trent, Maddox's operations officer, declared extraction infeasible, the risk to more aircraft and crews unacceptable. He insisted they wait for CAS and artillery to suppress the enemy before any medevac attempt. Maddox agreed and ordered everyone to hold and wait for fire support. From the back of the room, Avery spoke up. She could get in. She said she'd flown worse approaches, under worse conditions, and warned that if they sat on their hands for another hour, half those Marines would bleed out in that ditch. Colonel Maddox turned toward her as if she'd just said something obscene. He told her she didn't grasp the tactical picture, that she was a medevac pilot, not a combat strategist, and that her job was to wait for orders. Major Trent didn't bother with tact. He snapped that they didn't need a junior warrant officer with a hero complex getting more men killed, that she should sit down and let the real officers solve it. The room went dead quiet. Every man there heard the insult, and they all knew it wasn't about her rank or record. It was about her being a woman, and in their eyes that made her judgment questionable. Avery walked out without a word, crossing the flight line toward her Blackhawk baking under the Afghan sun. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Reeves, and door gunner, Specialist Vega, were halfway through pre-flight checks. They saw her expression and asked if they were heading out. She didn't answer right away. She stood in the rotor's shadow, staring past the wire toward the mountains where hundreds of Marines were dying. Her mind flashed to her father, to the day he'd taught her to land blind in a dust storm, sitting calm in the left seat, hands off the controls, letting her feel her way down through the brownout with only the instruments and nerve to guide her. He'd told her fear was just information, that the trick was to let it sharpen, not smother focus, and that the worst sin a pilot could commit was hesitation when lives depended on her. She remembered Kunar, the recon team, rounds punching through the skin of her aircraft, her co-pilot freezing while she flew them out by instinct alone. She remembered those 4 men stepping off alive because she hadn't left them. And now she remembered Maddox's tone and Trent's smirk, the way they'd looked at her like a kid playing dress-up in a uniform she hadn't earned. Then she stopped remembering and started acting. Avery told Reeves and Vega to finish pre-flight and ordered her co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Nolan Chu, to spin up the APU and bring the rotors online. When Chu asked if they had clearance, she said they would by liftoff. It wasn't true, but her conviction made it sound like it was. She strode back into the operations center where Maddox still stood over the map and told him flat out she was taking her bird in. She didn't need fire support, didn't need permission, and if he wanted to court-martial her later, he could, but right now she was the only pilot willing to try. Maddox stared at her. He asked if she understood what insubordination meant. She said she did. He asked if she knew the mission she was talking about was suicide. She said sitting here while Marines bled out was worse. Trent stepped forward, furious, calling her out of line, saying she was risking her crew and her aircraft on a lost cause. He warned she was gambling her crew and her aircraft on a mission already labeled impossible, and if she went down, no one was coming to pull her out. Avery met his eyes and said flatly she wasn't asking for a rescue. Then she turned and left. By the time she hit the flight line, the word had spread. Pilots stood outside their birds, some angry, some anxious, none brave enough to stop her. Reeves, Vega, and Chu were already strapped in. The rotors were spinning, throwing up a storm of dust that swallowed the horizon. Avery climbed into the left seat, fastened her helmet, and ran through final checks. Her hands moved on instinct, flipping switches and setting controls, while her mind raced 3 steps ahead, mapping approaches, anticipating every failure point. The radio cracked alive with Colonel Maddox's voice, cold and clipped. He told her if she took off without clearance, a full investigation would follow. Her career, he said, would end the second those rotors lifted. Avery keyed the mic, said she understood, then pulled pitch and felt the Black Hawk rise. The hop to Carez Valley took 18 minutes. She flew nap of the earth, hugging terrain, skimming through wadis and dry riverbeds to stay below the ridgelines where enemy spotters nested. Chu sat silent in the right seat, hands hovering near the controls in case she faltered. Reeves and Vega manned the M240s, scanning the desert for muzzle flashes. Then the LZ appeared, a pale scar of sand, wide enough for a Black Hawk, but naked on 3 sides. 600 meters east, Marines were pinned in a ditch, barely visible through the haze. Avery saw the flash of enemy rifles from the hills and the white plumes of mortars stitching the ground between them. She keyed the radio and reached the company commander below. His voice was strained, breaking under static. 83 criticals, he said. Another 122 shot up to move. The Taliban had zeroed the LZ, and any bird that tried to land would last seconds. Avery said nothing. She was already calculating. The approach had to be steep and fast, dropping from the west where the angles were worst for incoming fire. She'd flare at the last heartbeat, bleed speed, and settle just long enough to load bodies before the sky fell on them. The danger wasn't touching down, it was staying put. She shoved the cyclic forward, diving hard. The Black Hawk fell like a stone, altimeter spinning down. She held the descent until the ground blurred upward, then yanked back, flaring nose high in a violent deceleration that rattled every rivet in the airframe. The skids kissed sand. Reeves and Vega were already out, firing controlled bursts into the high ground. Through the dust came Marines, carrying stretchers, dragging the wounded, stumbling through fire toward the bird. Bullets cracked past the canopy. Avery heard the metallic snap of rounds punching through the tail boom. An RPG screamed overhead and detonated 50 meters out, raining shrapnel across the riverbed. She stayed locked on the controls, feeling the shifting weight as bodies filled the cabin, counting seconds, counting souls. She kept her breathing slow, her focus locked. When Reeves flashed the signal, Avery lifted the pitch. The Black Hawk clawed upward, heavy with wounded men and burning fuel, the rotors biting for sky. She banked west, feeling a round punch through the fuselage behind her seat. The airframe rattled but held. That was the first of 7 trips. 7 landings in that scorched riverbed. 7 flights back to Camp Liberty, the cabin slick with blood and filled with the ragged breathing of men clinging to life. She flew through fire that shredded armor plates and peeled paint from the fuselage. She flew until the low-fuel light glared red, stopping only long enough to refuel at a forward outpost before diving back into the valley. Twice, Chu offered to take the controls when her hands trembled from exhaustion. Twice, she shook her head and kept flying. Every sortie, she packed the bird to its limits, litters stacked tight. The walking wounded pressed shoulder to shoulder. Medics crouched over bodies trying to slow the bleeding while rounds hammered through thin metal skin. By sunset, she had pulled 63 Marines out of that hell. The rest followed when other pilots finally joined the run, emboldened after Avery proved it could be done. By the time the task force finished moving casualties through the night, every one of the 341 Marines was alive. She set the Black Hawk down for the last time just after dark. The aircraft was wrecked. 47 bullet holes, hydraulic fluid leaking across the tarmac, one main rotor blade torn so badly the maintenance chief said it was a miracle it hadn't failed mid-air. Reeves, Vega, and Chu climbed out in silence, too drained to speak. Avery stayed in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, staring into the dark until her body remembered how to move. When she finally stepped down, Colonel Maddox was waiting by the landing pad. He looked at her, then at the battered bird. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he told her she'd saved more lives in a single day than most pilots did in an entire tour, and that she'd also defied a direct order and risked her crew beyond reason. He said he'd be recommending her for the Distinguished Flying Cross, but there'd still be an Article 92 investigation for disobedience, though he'd argue her actions fell within combat discretion. Avery nodded, saying she understood. Maddox almost smiled and said he doubted she really did, but maybe one day she would. The Marines she pulled from Caras Valley sent letters, emails. Some even came to see her before she rotated home. They called her the Angel of Caras, a name she couldn't stand. They told her she was the reason they made it back to their families. Word spread, fast as wildfire. Trent never apologized, but he stopped cutting her off in briefings. The other officers started asking her opinion. The younger pilots watched how she flew, how she thought under fire. 2 years later, Avery left the Army and went home to Nevada, becoming a civilian flight instructor teaching search and rescue to pilots who wanted to fly where others wouldn't dare. She rarely mentioned Caras unless asked directly. When she did, she said the truth, that she'd been lucky, that her crew had been solid, and that the hardest part of doing what's right is realizing not everyone will believe you can. Her father came to see her after she returned. They took his old Hughes 500 up, threading through the mountain passes just like when she was 16. When they landed, he didn't say much, just told her he was proud. She said she knew. He smiled and said no, she didn't. What she did over Caras wasn't just flying, it was trust. Trusting herself when no one else would. She thought about that for a long time, she still does.